A simple act of kindness, but what happened next will change everything. When the millionaire learns the truth about the boy, he is shocked. Anthony was used to the cold. He had grown up with it, in a city where winter was an indifferent force. But tonight it was different. Tonight it was personal. His thick wool coat couldn't block out the loneliness that seemed to seep into his bones. He had spent another evening in the company of luxury, surrounded by his wealth, yet something gnawed at him. His mansion felt like a cage, and no amount of expensive furniture or fine art could make him forget that emptiness. The streets outside felt like a refuge. The night air was biting, but it was less suffocating than the silence of his home. Anthony's footsteps echoed as he walked, lost in his thoughts. It wasn't until he turned the corner, near an old, cracked storefront, that he saw him. The boy was hunched over, hands stuffed into his threadbare coat, shaking violently against the cold. Anthony paused. The boy couldn't have been older than 12, his face pale from the bitter chill. His clothes were nothing more than rags, and yet his eyes held a sort of quiet strength. Without thinking, Anthony moved closer. "Hey, you all right?" His voice was a soft interruption to the harsh sounds of the night. The boy's head jerked up, startled. He looked at Anthony, sizing him up quickly, an uncertain flicker crossing his face. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Anthony shook his head, barely hearing the words. He could see the trembling, the exhaustion. This wasn't a situation for words, not anymore. Without waiting for the boy's response, he crouched down. "You're not fine. You need to get out of this cold." The boy looked down at his worn shoes, then back up at Anthony, a quiet wariness in his eyes. "Why would you help me?" His question hung in the air like a challenge. Anthony hesitated. It wasn't a question he had prepared for. "Because it's the right thing to do," he finally said, his voice steady despite the unfamiliarity of the situation. "Come on, I'll take you somewhere safe." The boy still didn't move, eyeing Anthony as though trying to figure out if he was being played. But as the cold wind picked up, his resistance faltered. He took a slow, cautious step forward, then another, before finally nodding. "All right," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Anthony led the way, his pace quick and purposeful. The streets, though empty, seemed to echo with the boy's silent steps behind him. As they walked, Anthony didn't say much. He didn't need to. The cold, the quiet, the shared tension between them, it spoke for itself. He didn't know what he expected when he invited the boy into his world, but this was uncharted territory. Anthony didn't know how to break the silence, nor did he know what to say to make this stranger feel comfortable in his life. The boy, too, seemed unwilling to speak, until they reached the gate of Anthony's mansion. "Here," Anthony said, opening the door and gesturing for the boy to step inside. The boy stood there for a moment, staring at the towering house. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice suddenly soft. "Anthony," he replied. "And you?" "Dan," came a quiet answer. Dan stepped inside, shivering despite the warmth of the house. Anthony closed the door behind them, then led the boy into the grand foyer. The mansion, with its high ceilings and expensive decor, was a stark contrast to the world Dan had just left behind. It was clear from the moment he stepped inside that Dan didn't belong here, not just in the sense of wealth, but in a deeper, more emotional way. He was a stranger to everything this house represented. But it didn't matter. Anthony had made a decision, and now there was no turning back. Dan stood in the doorway, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of the mansion's grand interior. The warmth hit him like a wall, almost too much after the freezing streets. He hesitated, unsure of where to even start. Everything felt alien, so clean, so perfect. Nothing about this place felt like it had anything to do with him. Anthony noticed the hesitation, the way Dan was still wrapped in his own world of discomfort, despite the luxury around him. He watched the boy shift uncomfortably on his feet, unsure whether to move further into the house. "Come on," Anthony said softly, offering a welcoming smile. "Let me get you something to eat. You must be starving." Dan gave him a tentative look, as though assessing whether this offer was real. He had learned not to trust people too easily. "I don't need much," he muttered, his voice almost a whisper. Anthony didn't press him. Instead, he led the way to the kitchen, where a warm meal was waiting. The smell of food, something so basic and so foreign to Dan at the moment, filled the air. Anthony turned to him, the question lingering in the space between them. "You're safe here for now," he said. "No one's going to hurt you." Dan didn't answer immediately. He simply sat down at the kitchen table, his hands still clenched into fists, the residue of the cold that had been living under his skin for so long. Anthony set a plate of soup in front of him, the steam rising in soft tendrils. "It's just soup," Anthony said, trying to ease the tension. "But it'll help." Dan took the spoon without looking up, shoveling the food into his mouth in quick, desperate bites. He didn't seem to care about the quality of the food. He just needed warmth. He needed comfort. As he ate, Anthony sat across from him, quietly observing. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was thick with the weight of unspoken words. "I don't have anything to give you," Dan said suddenly, his voice almost guilty. "No way to repay you." "I don't." "Chill." Anthony cut him off, his tone firm but not unkind. "You don't owe me anything. No one should have to earn kindness. You just take what you need." Dan looked up then, meeting Anthony's gaze for the first time. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps disbelief or a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. Anthony saw the guarded way the boy was still holding himself, and realized just how fragile trust really was. He had offered Dan food, shelter, safety, but it wasn't enough to erase years of hardship. "Why?" Dan asked, his voice a little less guarded. "Why help me?" Anthony hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain it. He wasn't sure he even fully understood it himself. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "No one should have to live like that. It's just what we do when we can." Dan didn't respond right away. Instead, he focused on his food, the spoon now moving slower. Anthony watched him, sensing the walls that were starting to come down, piece by piece. "You could have walked by," Dan said quietly, breaking the silence. "You could have ignored me. You didn't have to stop." Anthony smiled faintly. "No, I couldn't have." The words lingered between them, but this time, there was less tension, less of the awkwardness that had defined their interactions since they met. It was the beginning of something, a shift in both of them. Anthony didn't know where this would go or how it would end, but he knew that it was already changing him. And maybe, just maybe, it was changing Dan too. When Dan finished the soup, Anthony showed him to a guest room upstairs. "You can stay here for the night. Rest." Dan nodded, but again his body language was distant. He stood at the door, looking around the room. The bed looked too big, too comfortable, too unlike anything he had ever known. "Thank you," Dan said quietly, as though unsure whether the words were even enough to express the depth of his gratitude. "You don't have to thank me," Anthony replied, his voice soft. "Just get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll talk." And with that, Anthony left the room, closing the door behind him. He didn't expect to solve everything in one night. He didn't expect miracles, but he was willing to try. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of something other than loneliness. The night passed in a quiet stillness. Anthony woke early the next morning, the sunlight spilling into his room through large windows that overlooked the city. He had no particular plans for the day, just the usual work, meetings, and the emptiness that came with it. But now his mind kept drifting back to the boy, Dan. Had he slept well? Was he still here? Anthony wasn't sure why it bothered him, but he found himself restless, thinking about the boy's quiet presence in his house, unsure of how to bridge the distance between them. Downstairs, Anthony found Dan in the kitchen, sitting at the table again, staring out the window. He had barely touched the food that Anthony had left for him. The boy's posture was still closed off, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, as though trying to make himself small. "You don't have to stay in here," Anthony said gently, leaning against the doorway. "There's a whole house for you to explore. You're welcome to move around. Get comfortable." Dan glanced up at him briefly, then looked back out the window. The cold, gray sky seemed to mirror the boy's mood. He didn't respond to Anthony's words, as if they didn't reach him. Anthony felt a flicker of frustration. The kindness he had extended, the food, the shelter, it didn't seem to matter. Dan was still stuck, locked in a place that Anthony couldn't understand. And that frustrated him more than he cared to admit. "Dan," Anthony said, trying again, walking into the room. "What do you want?" I'm not going to force you to do anything you don't want to do. Dan shifted in his seat, finally looking up at Anthony. There was a faint glimmer of something in his eyes. Something like exhaustion, maybe fear, but there was also something else, a crack in the walls that had been built up over time. The boy was finally allowing himself to be seen, if only for a moment. I don't know, Dan said, his voice quieter now. I don't know what to do with any of this. Anthony sat down across from him. You don't have to know right now. I'm not asking you to figure everything out in one day. Dan looked at him then, his expression unreadable. You don't get it, he muttered. I've never been given anything for free. No one ever cared enough to just help me. People don't do that. They don't. Anthony felt a knot form in his chest. I know it's hard to believe, but I'm not like the others. I'm not doing this because I expect something in return. Dan shook his head. I don't need your pity. I don't want it. Anthony exhaled sharply, but his voice remained steady. This isn't about pity, Dan. It's about giving you a chance. A real chance. No strings attached. Silence filled the room again. Anthony could see that the boy was torn, unsure whether to trust him or push him away. The life Dan had known, the one of abandonment, rejection, and survival, didn't allow for simple acts of kindness. That was the hard truth. I don't trust anyone, Dan finally admitted, his voice raw. Not anymore, and I don't know if I ever will. The words hit Anthony harder than he expected. The depth of the boy's pain was undeniable, and yet it made something inside Anthony shift. It wasn't just about taking care of Dan or offering him shelter. It was about understanding this deep, unspoken wound, the kind that could only heal with time and consistent care. Something that Anthony hadn't truly learned to give anyone until now. You don't have to trust me right away, Anthony said quietly. But I'm here. I'll give you the time you need. Dan didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the cup of coffee Anthony had made earlier but hadn't touched. He took a long sip, his eyes still distant. Anthony watched him, unsure of how to proceed, but resolute in one thing. He wasn't going to give up on this. Look, Anthony said after a beat, if you don't want to talk right now, that's fine. I'll be around. But if you need anything at all, you let me know. I don't expect you to open up to me. Not today. But I want you to know you're not alone anymore. For the first time since he had met Dan, Anthony saw the faintest trace of something in the boy's face. A flicker of recognition, as if, for just a moment, he believed that Anthony wasn't lying. But before he could say anything, Dan looked down at his coffee, as though the moment had passed. I'll just stay here, Dan said, his voice almost imperceptible. For now, Anthony nodded. Take your time. The silence between them stretched long, but this time, it felt different. There was no judgment in it, no distance. Just two people, each with their own scars, trying to find some semblance of understanding in the quiet. Anthony didn't know what the future held for Dan or for himself. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. The day passed quietly. Anthony went about his usual routine, but his mind was never far from Dan. The boy was still a mystery to him, an enigma wrapped in layers of distrust and fear. Anthony had offered his kindness, yet it seemed as though nothing could pierce the barrier Dan had built around himself. By the time the evening came, the mansion felt too big again, its vast emptiness echoing with the unspoken words between them. Dinner was served, but Dan barely touched his plate. He sat across from Anthony, his gaze fixed on his hands, his fingers fidgeting nervously with the edge of his sleeve. Anthony noticed the silence between them, felt the weight of it. It wasn't a comfortable silence, not anymore. There was an unspoken tension, a divide that had not yet been crossed. He had hoped that time would soften the boy's resistance, but instead, it seemed to harden it. Dan, Anthony said gently, setting his fork down, I know this isn't easy, but you don't have to carry all of this by yourself. Dan didn't look up, but Anthony could see his jaw tighten. I'm fine, he muttered, his voice distant. No, you're not, Anthony replied, his voice steady. You don't have to pretend with me. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Dan looked up, his eyes meeting Anthony's for the first time that evening. There was a flicker of something like vulnerability, and it made Anthony's chest tighten. I don't know how to be anything but this, Dan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to trust anyone, not after everything I've been through." Anthony's heart ached at the pain in his words, but he said nothing. He simply waited. He knew the boy wasn't ready to open up yet, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you could do. Wait and be there when the time came. Dan took a deep breath, then looked away again. "My parents, they died when I was young. I don't really remember them, but I remember the day it happened. It was just a normal day until it wasn't." Anthony sat quietly, listening. He had no intention of interrupting. He wanted Dan to speak at his own pace, if he ever decided to do so. Dan's eyes became distant, as if the memories were playing out in his mind in real time. "I was just a kid, but I remember the way everything changed. The way people looked at me when I had no one else. No one wanted to take care of me. Not my aunts or uncles. So I ended up on the streets." His voice cracked, and Anthony saw a flicker of tears in Dan's eyes before the boy blinked them away quickly. Anthony clenched his jaw, his own emotions rising at the raw honesty of the boy's confession. "I've been on my own since then. I don't know how to trust anyone. Not when people always let me down." Anthony leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to do this alone anymore, Dan. Not if you don't want to." Dan looked at him again, this time with more intensity. His eyes were filled with a mixture of disbelief and hope, a dangerous combination that he wasn't ready to fully embrace yet. "Why? Why would you do this for me? I don't deserve it. I'm just a kid with nothing." Anthony's heart tightened in his chest. He wanted to say so much, to tell Dan that he deserved everything, that he had every right to a better life, that no one should be left to suffer alone. But he simply couldn't find the right words. Instead, he leaned back, giving the boy space to process what had just been said. "You don't have to earn kindness, Dan," Anthony said, his voice steady but gentle. "It's not about what you deserve. It's about what you need. And right now, you need a chance. I'm offering you that chance. Nothing more, nothing less." Dan sat there, his gaze fixed on Anthony, as if trying to weigh the truth in his words. The silence stretched again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a space filled with understanding, a space where the walls between them were starting to crumble. Finally, Dan spoke again, his voice quieter this time, but no less honest. "I don't know how to believe you. I don't know how to believe that people can actually care." Anthony nodded slowly, his expression softening. "You don't have to believe me right away. Trust takes time, but I'm not going anywhere, Dan. I'll be here no matter what." Dan didn't say anything else, but Anthony could see a flicker of something in his eyes, something he hadn't seen before. A small spark of hope, buried deep beneath the layers of hurt. The evening ended quietly. Anthony knew that Dan wasn't ready to accept everything, not yet. But the boy had spoken his truth, and for the first time since they had met, Anthony felt that they were on the same path. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, they could walk it together. The next morning, Anthony woke to the sound of soft footsteps downstairs. He wasn't surprised to find Dan up already. The boy hadn't been able to rest properly the night before, as though the silence of the mansion was too overwhelming. Anthony had tried to offer him comfort, but Dan had kept to himself, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Anthony stood by the large window in his room, his gaze lingering on the city below. His thoughts were a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and something else, something unsettling. He couldn't help but wonder about Dan's past. The boy had spoken little, but there had been enough in his words to know that life had dealt him a cruel hand. Anthony had lived a life of wealth and privilege. Yet hearing Dan's story made him feel like his own troubles were insignificant in comparison. It was strange how something as simple as a conversation could make you reflect on your own life. Anthony had everything a man could want: money, a successful career, a beautiful home. Yet, he had never felt the kind of peace he imagined other people had. His life was marked by an emotional emptiness, something he couldn't shake, no matter how many accolades or material possessions came his way. He thought back to his own childhood, his father's absence, his mother's early death. Anthony had grown up with a deep sense of abandonment, the kind of pain that no one could see from the outside. But it had shaped him. It had made him determined to succeed, to never feel weak or vulnerable again. He had buried the hurt so deep that he rarely even acknowledged it. The knock on his door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Dan stepped inside, his eyes still tired, but there was something softer in his gaze today. Maybe it was the weight of yesterday's conversation, or maybe it was just the first real connection they had made. Either way, the change, however small, was evident. "Morning," Anthony greeted, his voice casual but warm. Dan nodded, standing awkwardly by the door. I didn't want to intrude. Just thought I'd check in." "You're not intruding," Anthony reassured him. "Come in. We need to talk." Dan hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room. Anthony motioned for him to sit down, and the boy complied, sitting on the edge of the chair like he was still unsure of his place in the world. Anthony could see the walls, the defenses, still up around him. But he also saw a flicker of trust beginning to take root. "I want to tell you something," Anthony began, his voice steady but filled with an honesty he hadn't shown in a long time. "You've shared a lot with me, and I think it's time I share something with you." Dan raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. "I haven't always had this life," Anthony continued, his gaze distant as he spoke. "I wasn't born with money, with everything handed to me. I grew up without my father. My mother died when I was young. I was alone a lot. I had to figure things out on my own, and it wasn't easy." Dan watched him intently, sensing the vulnerability in Anthony's words. "I spent most of my life trying to prove that I could handle things, that I could make it on my own," Anthony said, his voice quieter now. "But the truth is, no matter how successful I became, I was still that lonely kid, trying to fill the emptiness with things that didn't matter. That's why I get it, Dan. I understand the pain of being abandoned, of feeling like no one really cares." Dan was silent for a moment, his eyes not leaving Anthony's face. Anthony could see the boy processing what he had just said, trying to understand it, maybe even relating to it in some way. "I don't talk about this much," Anthony added, "but I think it's important for you to know that I'm not just helping you out of pity or charity. I see a lot of myself in you, more than I care to admit." Dan shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the revelation. But there was something else there, too. A curiosity, a softness that hadn't been present before. "You really mean it, don't you?" Dan asked, his voice small but earnest. "Yes," Anthony said firmly. "I do." There was a long pause before Dan spoke again. "I don't know how to trust people," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "How do you know when someone's not just using you?" Anthony leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "It's not easy, Dan. Trust isn't something that happens overnight. It takes time and it takes consistency. But I can promise you one thing. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here to help you. Not because I expect anything in return, but because you deserve a chance." Dan nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. For the first time, he seemed to let the walls come down just a little. "I don't know if I can believe that yet," he admitted. "But I'll try." Anthony smiled, a genuine, soft smile. "That's all I ask." The room was silent again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't heavy with uncertainty or doubt. It was filled with something hopeful, something tentative but real. Dan wasn't ready to let go of his pain just yet, and Anthony wasn't going to rush him. But in that moment, they both knew that the beginning of something important had started. And that, for both of them, was enough. The days that followed felt like they existed in a strange middle ground. Anthony continued with his life, but his routine felt different now. It wasn't just about meetings or paperwork, it was about Dan. He found himself wondering what the boy was doing, what he was thinking, and whether he was truly processing the things they had shared. Anthony had offered him a roof over his head, but now he realized it wasn't enough to just give him shelter. He had to do more. He had to give Dan a way out, a future, something that didn't just exist in the shadow of the streets. That evening, as the sun set and the mansion was bathed in the warm, golden light, Anthony called Dan into his office. The boy had been keeping to himself more lately, spending hours in the library or wandering through the rooms, his presence often faint, as if he still wasn't sure of his place in this strange world. Anthony had noticed the hesitations, the moments when Dan's eyes darted away from him, the unease that lingered in the air whenever their paths crossed. Dan entered the office quietly, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. Anthony sat at his desk, his expression serious but welcoming. "Sit down," Anthony said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Dan did as he was asked, lowering himself into the chair, still wary, still unsure. Anthony studied him for a moment, noticing the way the boy held himself, like he was bracing for something he couldn't control. "I've been thinking," Anthony began, his voice calm, measured. "You said you don't know how to trust people. I understand that. I do. But trust is a two-way street. It takes more than just words. It takes action. And I want to show you that I'm not just talking when I say I want to help you." Dan shifted in his seat, but didn't say anything. Anthony continued, "You're not going to change overnight, and I'm not expecting you to," Anthony said, leaning forward slightly. "But I can offer you a chance, a real chance, a way out of this, a way for you to build something for yourself." Dan's brow furrowed, a mixture of confusion and skepticism written on his face. "What are you talking about?" Anthony paused for a moment, making sure his words landed properly. "I'm offering you a chance to go back to school, Dan. I'll pay for your education, get you a tutor if you need one. You won't have to worry about the basics anymore. The food, the shelter, none of that. It'll be taken care of. But the most important thing is this. You'll have a future, a chance to do something you want to do, to become who you want to be." Dan sat in stunned silence, processing what Anthony had said. It didn't make sense to him. How could this be real? How could someone offer so much and ask for nothing in return? "You want me to go to school?" Dan asked, his voice barely audible. "But why? Why would you do that for me?" Anthony looked him straight in the eyes. "Because you deserve it. You deserve more than this. More than what you've been through. I don't care about your past. I care about your future. You don't have to live like this anymore." Dan's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but there was something else there now. A glimmer of something he had long abandoned. Hope, maybe, or the faintest belief that things could change. But it was so fragile, so easily broken. "I don't know if I can do it," Dan said quietly. "I don't know if I can believe that people actually want to help me without expecting something in return." Anthony leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. "You don't have to believe me right now. I'm not asking you to trust me completely, Dan. All I'm asking is that you take the first step. Just one. I'll be here to help you along the way." Dan looked down at his hands, his fingers still trembling slightly. The room was filled with an uneasy silence, as if both of them were waiting for something to happen. Anthony could see the fear in the boy's eyes, the walls that had been built so high, so thick, that it would take time, maybe years, to tear them down. But Anthony knew something that Dan hadn't realized yet. Trust, real trust, could only grow from small acts, from moments like this one, where honesty and vulnerability were allowed to exist. Maybe I'll try," Dan said softly, his voice a little steadier. "But I don't know if I can ever be what you want me to be." Anthony smiled gently, his expression full of understanding. "You don't have to be anyone other than yourself. Just take the step, and we'll figure the rest out together. That's all I can ask." The room felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of their unspoken fears had shifted, if only for a moment. Anthony knew it wouldn't be easy. Change never was, but it had to start somewhere, and he was willing to help Dan take that first step, even if it meant walking through the uncertainty together. Dan stood up, his shoulders still tense, but there was something different in the way he moved now, a subtle shift, a willingness to let himself believe in the possibility of something better. "All right," he said, his voice a little more confident than before. "I'll try." And for the first time, Anthony believed it. He believed that Dan, however broken he might feel, could find a way to rebuild himself, to rebuild his trust. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, Anthony wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. The days that followed were quieter than usual. Dan had started attending school, a decision that had seemed impossible only a week ago. Anthony had arranged everything: tuition, books, a tutor to help him catch up. And now, each day, Dan ventured into the unknown. It wasn't easy. Every morning, he left the mansion with a reluctant step, his eyes constantly scanning the world around him like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Anthony watched from the sidelines, offering encouragement without pressing too hard. He knew this was a delicate process. Dan was still learning how to trust, how to believe that good things could happen to him without any hidden strings attached. Anthony could see the boy's struggle, the constant internal battle that played out every time he stepped out the door. But there was also progress, slow but steady. Some days were better than others, and those were the days Anthony held on to. One evening, after a long day of classes, Dan returned to the mansion. He was unusually quiet, his expression distant, and Anthony could tell that something was weighing on him. It wasn't just the exhaustion from school. There was a deeper discomfort, an internal conflict that Dan wasn't ready to share yet. "How was school today?" Anthony asked, trying to sound casual as he sat down at the kitchen table. Dan sat down across from him, picking at his food without enthusiasm. "It was fine," Dan replied, his voice flat. "Nothing special." Anthony studied him carefully, sensing that something more was going on. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready, but I'm here if you need to." Dan glanced up at him, his eyes a mixture of frustration and confusion. "I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here," he said, his voice tight. "I don't know if I'm doing this right. Every time I try to focus, I keep thinking about everything I've lost, everything I'll never get back." Anthony sat back in his chair, taking in the words. He had expected this. Dan's past, the loss of his family, the rejection he had faced. It was never going to be something he could just forget, no matter how much Anthony tried to offer him. It wasn't as simple as offering a bed or a few comforting words. Dan had to make peace with his past before he could fully embrace the future. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," Anthony said gently, his voice softening. "It's okay to not have all the answers. I know it's hard, but every step you take, no matter how small, is progress. You're not in this alone." Dan looked away, staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. "It's just hard, you know? I've been alone for so long. I don't know how to stop being alone. And now, I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if I can trust that any of this is real." Anthony's heart tightened at the words. He knew that Dan's sense of trust had been shattered long ago, and that rebuilding it was going to be one of the hardest things he would ever do. But Anthony wasn't going to give up on him. He couldn't. Not now. "You don't have to believe everything at once," Anthony said, his tone firm yet kind. "But I can tell you this. I'm not going anywhere. You're here now, and you have a chance to change things. It's not going to happen overnight, but I believe in you. And I'm not going to stop showing you that you're worth it." Dan didn't respond immediately. He sat in silence, his gaze still distant. Anthony let the silence linger between them, allowing Dan the space he needed. He could see the boy wrestling with his doubts, his fears. But for the first time in a long time, Anthony could see a glimmer of something else, a tiny flicker of hope that had begun to take root. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to believe that," Dan said quietly, his voice shaky. "But maybe I can try." Anthony smiled softly. "That's all I'm asking. Just try. One step at a time." Dan nodded slowly, the weight of his emotions still heavy. But there was something different in his expression now. It wasn't resignation, but acceptance. He didn't have to have everything figured out today. He didn't have to carry the world on his shoulders. All he had to do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. And for the first time since they had met, Anthony saw a flicker of possibility in Dan's eyes. A possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way out of the darkness. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time, patience, and a lot of work. But it was a start, and for Anthony, that was enough. The following weeks passed in a blur of routines and moments of quiet reflection. Dan continued to attend school, though it wasn't without its challenges. Every morning, Anthony watched as the boy walked toward the front door, his posture still guarded, his pace hesitant. There was a small but noticeable difference, though. Each day, the weight seemed a little less heavy, the hesitation a little less noticeable. He was still unsure, still wrestling with his past, but Anthony saw a spark in him that had been absent before. Anthony had been trying to create a space for Dan to feel secure, to help him focus on building a future. But he also knew that words weren't enough. Dan had to experience the world beyond the mansion, beyond the protection and the safe walls they had created. He had to take risks, and Anthony wasn't sure how to push him without overwhelming him. It had to be his choice, just as much as it had been his choice to come here in the first place. One evening, after dinner, Anthony noticed that Dan was unusually quiet. It had been one of those days, a difficult one. He hadn't spoken much during dinner, hadn't participated in the usual small talk. Anthony could tell that something was off, but he didn't want to press too hard. Instead, he gave Dan some space, but as the evening wore on, the silence between them became too thick to ignore. Finally, Anthony broke it. "Dan, talk to me," he said gently, his voice calm. "What's going on?" Dan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze focused on the floor. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice rough. "I just feel like I'm not getting anywhere. Like I'm stuck. And it feels stupid to keep trying, you know? It's easier to just give up." Anthony leaned forward, his expression serious but empathetic. "I get it. You've been through a lot. It's not going to be easy, and some days will feel like you're not making any progress at all. But that doesn't mean you're stuck. It just means you're moving at your own pace. And that's okay." Dan met his eyes then, his face tense with frustration. "It's just hard. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can be someone different than what I've always been. And I feel like I'm failing. You gave me all this, school, a place to stay, and I'm just not good enough for it. I don't belong here." Anthony felt a sharp pang in his chest at those words. He had heard the frustration, the self-doubt, and the vulnerability in Dan's voice. It was a fear Anthony knew all too well, the fear of not being enough, of not living up to the expectations others had for you. He had been there himself, many times, long before he'd ever met Dan. And while he didn't have all the answers, he knew what he had to say. "You're not failing, Dan," Anthony said, his voice firm but kind. "The fact that you're here, that you're even trying, that's everything. It's easy to give up, but you're not doing that. You're showing up every day, even when it feels impossible. And that's what matters." Dan looked away again, rubbing his hands together nervously. "I don't know if I can believe you," he whispered. "It feels like it's too late for me, like I've already ruined everything." Anthony exhaled slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of Dan's words. He understood how hard it was to believe in something when you had nothing but scars and a history of rejection. But he wasn't going to give up on Dan. Not now, not ever. "It's never too late," Anthony said softly. "You've made mistakes, we all do. But that doesn't define you. Your past doesn't have to be your future, and I know it's hard to see that right now. But I promise you, this is just the beginning for you." Dan didn't respond at first. The room was filled with silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was the kind of silence that came after a real conversation, the kind that let things settle, let them sink in. "You really think I can change?" Dan asked quietly, still unsure. Anthony nodded. "I do. It's not going to happen overnight, but I've seen you make progress. You're already changing. You're stronger than you think. And I believe in you." Dan's eyes softened for a moment, and Anthony could see a flicker of something in them. Something fragile, but real. "I'll try," Dan said quietly, a small but genuine promise. Anthony smiled, a quiet relief filling him. "That's all I ask." As the night wore on, they didn't speak much more. But Dan's presence in the room had changed. The walls that had been so high between them, so thick and impenetrable, had come down just a little. And Anthony knew that it was a step forward. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. In the days that followed, Anthony continued to see small signs of change in Dan. He started participating more in school, even joining a few extracurricular activities, things he would have never considered before. He still struggled with his doubts, still wrestled with his fears, but he was trying. And that was the most important thing. And for Anthony, watching that change unfold before his eyes was more than enough. He knew that it would take time, that there would be setbacks and moments of doubt. But as long as they kept taking those small steps forward, there was hope. And that was something worth holding on to. The weeks passed, and with them, the weight that had once clung to Dan seemed to lessen ever so slightly. It wasn't dramatic. There were still moments when he would pull away, when the old habits of distrust and isolation would creep in. But those moments were becoming fewer, and the boy was beginning to show signs of something Anthony hadn't expected: hope. It wasn't easy for Dan to admit it, let alone embrace it. But little by little, the layers of guardedness, the walls he had built up over years of abandonment and pain, began to crack. School was still a struggle, but he was showing up. He was participating. And for someone like Dan, who had learned to survive by shutting people out, this was monumental. Antony watched it all from the sidelines, careful not to push too hard, but always there, offering support when it was needed. Every day, he offered Dan something different, another chance, another opportunity to grow, to learn that he wasn't defined by his past. But in the back of his mind, Antony wondered how long it would last. Was this fragile progress real? Or was it just another cycle of hope that would break again? One evening, as they sat in the living room together, the silence stretched between them, a familiar yet new kind of tension. Dan had been distant all day, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Antony had noticed how quiet he had become. It wasn't the usual silence. It was deeper, filled with something more ominous, a shift in his demeanor that Antony couldn't ignore. "Hey," Antony said gently, breaking the silence. "What's on your mind?" Dan didn't immediately answer. He stared at the floor, fidgeting with his sleeve, his hands pulling at the fabric nervously. Antony could see that the boy was battling something inside him, something he hadn't shared yet. "I don't know if I can do this," Dan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Antony's chest tightened at the words, even though he had been expecting them. "Do what?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though a part of him feared what was coming. This whole thing," Dan said, his voice cracking slightly. "School, being here, trying to be someone better than what I've been. I don't know if I'm cut out for it. I don't know if I can be that person you want me to be." Antony's heart sank. He had seen this moment coming, but hearing it out loud still hit harder than he expected. He leaned forward, his gaze steady but filled with understanding. "Dan, I'm not asking you to be someone else. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be you. And that's enough." Dan's eyes lifted slowly, but there was a deep sadness there. "But what if I'm not enough?" His voice trembled, the fear in his words raw and real. "What if all this effort, all this time, what if I don't change? What if I just end up failing?" Antony paused. There were so many things he could say, but nothing seemed to ease the fear in Dan's eyes. He couldn't promise that it would be easy. He couldn't promise that there wouldn't be setbacks. But he could offer something real, something he knew Dan needed to hear. "It's not about being perfect," Antony said softly. "It's about showing up every day, no matter what. It's about trying. That's all anyone can ask. It's about the effort, not the outcome." Dan looked down again, his hands still clenched tightly in his lap. "But I don't know if I can keep trying. I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep going." "Yes, you are," Antony said firmly, his voice unyielding. "You've already proven you're strong enough. Every day that you choose to keep going, every time you show up, even when it's hard, you're proving it to yourself. And that's the only thing that matters. The fact that you're still here, that you're still trying, that's strength. I believe in you, Dan. I always have." For a moment, the room was silent again. But this time, it wasn't filled with doubt or fear. It was filled with a quiet understanding that sometimes just being there for someone is enough. Dan didn't respond, but there was a shift in his eyes, something that made Antony believe he was hearing it, really hearing it for the first time. "I don't know if I'll ever be good enough," Dan whispered, more to himself than to Antony. Antony's heart ached for the boy, for the way he still saw himself as broken, as unworthy of the second chance he had been given. But Antony knew something that Dan didn't yet see. The very fact that Dan was questioning his worth meant he was starting to care, starting to see that maybe, just maybe, he was deserving of a life that didn't have to be defined by his past. "Dan," Antony said gently, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "You are already enough. You don't have to change all at once. Just keep being you, and that's enough for me. That's all I need to see." Dan didn't say anything more that night. He didn't need to. There was a sense of quiet understanding between them, an unspoken agreement that things weren't perfect and they never would be. But they didn't need to be. In the days that followed, Dan didn't suddenly transform into someone else. He didn't erase his doubts or his fears, but he kept moving forward, one small step at a time. And with each step, Antony knew that he was helping him build something that would last. A belief in himself, a belief that he could be more than the boy he thought he was. It was a long road ahead, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was a road worth walking. And for the first time, Antony wasn't afraid of the future. Together, they would face whatever came, one step at a time. Months passed, and the changes in Dan were subtle but undeniable. It wasn't that he had suddenly become a different person, someone entirely new, but the shifts were there, small victories, moments where his past didn't define him quite as strongly. He was starting to believe that the future could be his to shape. He attended school with a sense of purpose now, not just because Antony had encouraged him, but because he had begun to see his own potential. He was no longer just a boy surviving the days. He was beginning to live them. It was a Thursday evening a few months after the conversation in the living room. Dan was sitting at the kitchen table, a pile of homework spread out in front of him. It wasn't the first time he had sat there to do his work, but tonight, something felt different. He wasn't dreading it. He wasn't rushing through it in hopes of escaping back into his own thoughts. There was a focus in him now, a quiet determination. Antony walked in, his footsteps light as he approached the table. He had been watching Dan, noticing the change, but never once wanted to call attention to it. He didn't want to interrupt the boy's progress with words that might feel like praise or expectation. Dan needed to own this moment. He needed to see the results of his own hard work. "You're really sticking with it," Antony said, his voice soft but full of meaning. "How's it going?" Dan looked up at him, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't the wide grin of a child eager to please, but the calm, proud smile of a young man who had finally found a sense of ownership over his own path. "It's going good," Dan replied, his voice steady. "I actually think I get it now. I don't know if I'm perfect, but I think I'm getting somewhere." Antony's chest tightened at the words. For so long, he had been waiting for this moment. The day when Dan could say it, could believe it. Antony had always known that this journey was never going to be about perfection. It was about progress, about finding the strength to keep moving forward, even when everything seemed impossible. "Of course you're getting somewhere," Antony said gently, stepping closer. "You've always had it in you. It's been there all along. You just needed the chance to see it." Dan nodded, his eyes still focused on the homework in front of him. "I think I'm starting to believe that. It's hard sometimes, you know? I still have moments when I think about everything I've been through, the way things used to be, but it's different now. I know that I'm not that kid anymore." Antony sat down next to him, watching him with a quiet pride. "You've made so much progress, and you're still going, even when it's hard. That's what counts." Dan glanced over at him then, his eyes meeting Antony's with a look that spoke volumes. It was a look of gratitude, of understanding, of something that was slowly beginning to replace the isolation and self-doubt that had once consumed him. "I couldn't have done it without you," Dan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Antony felt a lump form in his throat at the words. He had been waiting for this moment, but hearing it still caught him off guard. He had never expected Dan to say it outright. He had never expected him to feel the same sense of connection, of trust, that Antony had worked so hard to build. But here they were. "You don't have to thank me," Antony replied, his voice steady but emotional. "You did all the hard work. I was just here to help guide you when you needed it." Dan shook his head, a soft chuckle escaping him. "I think you're being modest. I don't think I would have even started if it weren't for you." Antony smiled, his gaze softening. "I'm glad you started. But the rest of the journey, it's all you. And I'm proud of you for that." Dan's face softened at the words, and for a moment, there was a long silence between them. But it was a good silence, filled with understanding and a shared sense of accomplishment. They had both come a long way, each in their own way, but side by side. Antony had been the anchor, the one who had kept Dan from drifting, from losing himself in the currents of his past. But Dan had done the rest. He had fought his own battles, faced his own fears, and found the courage to keep moving forward. As the night wore on, they sat together, not talking much, but simply being there for one another. Antony knew that this was just the beginning for Dan. There would be struggles ahead, there always were. But now, Dan had the strength to face them. He had learned that it was okay to fall, as long as you kept getting back up. And Antony would always be there to help him. just as he had promised. For the first time in a long time, Anthony allowed himself to truly believe that the boy who had once walked into his life as a stranger, uncertain and broken, was on his way to becoming someone who would stand tall on his own. He had found his own path, and Anthony had been lucky enough to walk beside him for a while. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding between them, Anthony knew that he had done something more important than any business deal or accomplishment. He had helped someone find hope, and that was enough. In a world that often feels overwhelming, we forget that small steps forward can lead to profound change. Dan's journey shows us that even when we feel broken, there's always a chance to rebuild, one decision, one act of kindness at a time. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up, trying, and believing that we deserve better. Sometimes the hardest part is just starting. If you believe in the power of transformation, if you think that even the smallest gestures can change a life, don't let this story end here. Share it, like it, and leave a comment below with your thoughts because your voice matters. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button. Let's keep walking this path of growth and inspiration together.